each other over rulers that don't like you. Prefer us trapped in melancholy with the wood ones of holly. Suggestions that obliterate to camouflage the folly. Attempted mental robbery, executed sloppily. The hypocrisy, this mockery, and block the talk with me. Put the hands up to touch the akasha, cause you know deep down there's something bigger than your wallet. Screens, it's a plot to drop the IQ. Fighting amongst each other over rulers that don't like you. Prefer us trapped in melancholy with the wood ones of holly. Suggestions that obliterate to camouflage the folly. Attempted mental robbery, executed sloppily. The hypocrisy, this mockery, and block the talk with me. Put the hands up to touch the akasha, cause you know deep down there's something bigger than your wallet.
Sweet eternal balance of all that is good, true, and beautiful, friends. It is my honor to have a guest on Rogue Ways tonight who is able to find the red thread of continuity through the chaos of modern pop culture, pulling apart the woven tapestry of devious control and manipulation that leaves a trail of tortured fray in its path. The DJ and musical journalist, the author of Musical Truth, Tales from the Flip Side, and most recently, The Cause and the Cure, the man himself, Mark Devlin. Welcome to Rogue Ways, and thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on, Lindsay. And you wouldn't want to try and say that after 5 beers, would you?
No. I try to practice ahead of time, and I still will fuck it up sometimes. But before we get started tonight, I want to remind everyone that you can find a lot more content on my site at rogueways.org. You can grab a tarot reading while you're there. You can donate to my PayPal if you want to support the show. If you found some value and you want to give some value back, that's always much appreciated. On my PayPal link that you'll see there, you can grab my book, Sine Curve of Aeons, if you want to donate $15. It's cheaper than you can get it on Amazon because the shipping and the taxes are not included, and so I'll ship that anywhere in the United States to you with an inscription to you that you would love. And you can support me on Subscribestar as well, subscribestar.com/rogue-ways. I just added the $1 level for anyone who just, wants to be the sort of steady seed that keeps going and supports all the way through. That's really helpful. Even at $1, I appreciate it so much. And anyone who subscribes higher than the $1 level gets a free copy of Sine Curve. So that's also a little bonus thrown in there to you. And I just like to mention that the podcast is back up and running for anyone who has been mad that they had to listen through YouTube and not be able to listen through their car for the past few months. It's back up on any podcast app, so check that out as well. And now, Mark, I like to start with a pointless question of the episode, and it's not so pointless given your background and interest, but I'm wondering, and hopefully everyone doesn't ask you this question all of the time, but what is your favorite genre and why?
My favorite genre of music, we're talking? Okay. Well, yeah, just clarifying. My favorite genre of music, I would say, is rap and hip hop. Wow. But I always have to put a disclaimer on it because if people switch on the radio in 2020, and listen to what purports to be rap and hip hop, they're going to hear a whole load of straight garbage that belongs at the very bottom of a cesspit. And it does not reflect the original essence of this art form, of this music, and where it came from. So when I say I'm a fan of rap and hip hop, I'm talking about the golden years, the golden era, which for me is primarily late 80s to mid 90s. If I had to narrow it down, I would say around about 1988 to about 95. That's when the real quality product came out. Sadly, from 96 onwards, we've seen a downward regression and degeneration in the style of the genre, in terms of lyrical content, in terms of production methods, in terms of agendas that music, if we can even call it music, is being used to push. So it's a very sad and tragic thing for me to acknowledge what has happened to that particular scene. But when we look at those incredible years when the genre was at its most creative apex, that takes some beating in my book.
Yeah. Oh, wow. People who are watching this right now might think that you and I conspired about this ahead of time, but I just want everyone to know that this is totally organic and not planned. And I'm totally with you that...
You feel that stuff too?
Yeah, I really love hip hop, and I really think it's sad that people don't understand the roots of it, like you were saying, and that people look at this sort of modern garbage and think that is hip hop and rap. And I realize that it is, but they're not the same at all. And one of the things that I think is really sad is that this comes from a rich historical culture in place of almost like rebellion against the power system in a way, right? Like hip hop, from what I understand, was meant to be, hip was like, you know, understanding the truth, and hop was carrying it forward to others. And so it was a method of sharing information and teaching each other and keeping each other, you know, feeling empowered about things. And now it's almost exactly the opposite. You know, but that those roots I think are important. And I think when people sort of dismiss the whole entire genre, they miss so much culture and history that even if you don't like the style, even if you go back and listen to that more conscious sort of hip hop and you still don't like it, like that's fine, but to at least be able to acknowledge that that is a part of culture that's important, you know.
I speak to a lot of people in the truth/conspiracy/alternative media game, and they've got very little time for the genre of hip hop, and I can only think that's because they've not invested much time in listening to that older stuff, or maybe they're just concentrating on the current stuff and they quite rightly see it as garbage. But until you've invested a bit of research into what went before, you're not going to have an understanding of the complexities and the depth of this art form. And there are spiritual components to it, which I've spoken about on previous shows. I had a guy called Black Dot on one of my podcasts a few years back, and he talks about the same sort of stuff that you hear Professor Griff talking about, and KRS-One has talked about this as well. I've got a few reservations about KRS-One in the wake of the Africa Bambaataa revelations that came out a few years ago, and KRS-One's response to all of that. So that's kind of put him in a different light to me, unfortunately. But this guy Black Dot was talking about the fact that when you take the 5 basic principles or elements of hip-hop culture, so you expand it out from just the music, so you get the rapping, you get the turntablism, which is where DJs are using turntables like musical instruments. It's an incredibly creative process. You got the graffiti art, you got the b-boy dancing, and then the 5th element in all of this is known as knowledge of self. So you hear a lot of original hip-hop heads talking about knowledge of self, and Black Dot was breaking it down as like this culture comes from African communities and cultures going way back. And when Africans were brought to the United States, they brought with them some genetic memory of these aspects of their culture that was embedded into them. And so when hip-hop culture began in the 1970s, it was black people reenacting this stuff that had laid dormant in their DNA and expressing it through this new modern genre. And so he said the rapper, the modern day rapper, is a variation on the griot, which was a storyteller in African cultures. This was like a sage or a wise person that would sit around telling stories about where that culture came from.
It's almost like a shaman.
Yeah, a shaman, exactly. And then you had the ceremonial dancing, which used to take place in these cultures, and that's expressing itself through the breakdancing, the b-boy culture. Then you've got hieroglyphs and signs and symbols and sigils, which is coming through in the graffiti art. And then you've got the turntablism, which is very rhythmic when you think of scratching back and forth. This is similar to the drumming that used to happen in religious ceremonies coming out of these African cultures. And then the 5th element is knowledge of self, which is spirit. And it can also be expressed as earth, air, fire, water, spirit. It's these 5 elements which are coming through in the music. So when you take all that on board, suddenly you've got rather more than just a genre of music. You know, there's so much more there. And it goes into these metaphysical places, which a lot of people miss, I feel.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I like to call people's attention to, is that, you know, when you dismiss an entire genre, then you're cutting this off. And I think that's by design, and I could be wrong, but I think it seems like the sort of powers that be, however you want to look at this agenda, it sort of targets the most powerful aspects of ourselves. And I think this connection that we have, like you were saying, this is almost like a genetic memory that kind of came back through. And I think that's part of why it was probably targeted as, you know, the type of, or a genre to destroy and degrade and make into something.
It becomes clear that they were never going to leave this alone.
Right.
Once the power of this culture to influence and affect and uplift people was recognized, there's no way the control system that we have were going to leave it untarnished. There's no way they weren't going to hijack it and bastardize it and steer it off in their own desired directions. Sadly, they do this with all things. Anything that brings people together or has a hint of positivity about it gets targeted and infiltrated. So what they've done with hip hop culture in terms of taking it from what it was to the laughable, farcical state it's now in, and the degraded, debased, satanic garbage state it's now in.
Absolutely.
It is a tragic thing, but you can understand entirely why it was done when you have some kind of comprehension of the mindset of these psychopathic would-be controllers that we have.
Yes, and they're really, really smart. I mean, it's really intelligent to target that exact thing because, like you said, this is a powerful place of empowerment that it's really easy to connect, you know, even if you're not in a group with people at the concert, let's say, like, it's really easy to connect through music and to sort of transfer energy in that way. And so it's intelligent to target this, you know, specifically.
I do a radio show now on Saturday evenings, actually. So
cool.
It goes out 8 to 10 on Saturdays on an FM station in Oxford, my home city. And the show is called The Sound of Now. And on that show these days, I play soulful, uplifting house music. So I've got a long history in radio. I've been doing radio for about 30 years, and most of the shows that I've done have played hip hop and, you know, black music and urban music. Yeah. But it got to the point a few years ago where I just could not find enough quality new rap and hip hop to put on the radio. So I just decided to switch the musical style of the show and just go in there with soulful, uplifting house, because of all the different genres of dance music and black music, that is one field that I feel has not lost its integrity.
Yeah.
And the structure of the music and the message contained in the music and the way it makes you feel hasn't really changed over the past 30 years. Wow. And I can't say that for any other genre, really. You look at all other aspects of house music, dance music, and they've all changed. They've all been modernized. They've become electronic and digital, and they're pushing agendas with their symbolism and all this. Yeah. But with soulful, uplifting house, to me, it still sounds great, and it's still retained its original spirit. So I'm very happy to be associated with that, and I play 2 hours of that on the music on the radio each week.
Oh, that's awesome. Why do you think that the soulful, uplifting house music has sort of escaped that scourge, or, you know?
Well, I think it's because it generally appeals to a demographic of my kind of generation. So we're talking middle-aged people or people of mature years. Soulful house is not something that has ever been aimed at young people, and it's not something that ever really appeals to young people. Okay. If you're 17, 18, 19 and you're going out clubbing, you're going to want to listen to big room electronic dance music, or trance or techno or hard house or garage or grime or one of these genres, or drum and bass. The soulful house scene tends to appeal more to mature people in their 30s, 40s, 50s and above. And the social engineers of this world, who like to use culture to change public attitudes and subliminally affect us and mind control us, are only ever really interested in young people. They love young hearts, young minds, young souls, because they're so easy to manipulate, so easy to shape and mold, because they're naive in their outlook. People of my age, my generation, I've been around the block a few times. I've seen a thing or two. Right. I know a thing or two about a thing or two. So they don't want people of my age. They don't bother targeting people of my age, because I can see through the trickery in a way that a 17 or 18-year-old that is green and wet behind the ears is not going to be able to. So all these genres that are aimed at young people, and this brings us back to hip-hop in its current incarnation. All this bloody crap that gets served up to us now is aimed at young people. You know, it's not aimed at 40-year-olds. Because they're the ones that are always in the crosshairs of these controllers.
That's a really good point, and it brings up a few things in mind. And one is that there's this sort of trend I've noticed that it's becoming, you know, kind of popular, and people are kind of applauding people who say things like, well, I'm going to give my vote to my child because it's their future. And now I'm like, I guess, like, it's a weird kind of virtue signaling, but I'm like, do you really believe that a young person has the ability, the wisdom to understand what is best, you know, whether you think voting is real or not or whatever? Like, do you think that they have this ability? And I don't understand that mindset, except as a virtue signaling that's kind of otherwise empty, because I can't believe that people truly believe that young people have that wisdom and ability to reflect and choose what's best for an entire nation or region or whatever it is, you know? It's interesting.
But then again, you know, we've all been there. We've all been young. And I can remember when I was 17, 18, all the way through my 20s, I was being completely socially engineered and mind controlled.
Absolutely.
I had no idea it was going on.
And I thought I was
doing
the opposite.
Right. I was out there working as a DJ. I was a radio DJ, a club DJ, a music journalist, and I was pushing and promoting so many of these corporate acts that were getting served up by these big record companies. And I was doing my bit in helping these agendas to be pushed forward. But at the time, I did not understand that these were agendas. I had no comprehension of the way the world works. I had no realization that the world is nothing like we're entrained and conditioned to think that it is. It wasn't until 2010 that I got hip to all of this. Yeah. So all the way through the 90s and into the early 2000s, I was just going through the motions and doing everything that DJ does. And I was thinking about this today, actually. I was going back in my mind to the East Coast, West Coast beef of the mid-90s in hip-hop.
Tupac and Biggie. And...
You remember all that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So 1995, 96, this is when you had primarily Bad Boy Records out of New York with Sean Puffy Combs, Puff Daddy, at the helm, and Notorious B.I.G. as the prominent artist, going up against Suge Knight of Death Row Records in Los Angeles with Tupac as the prominent artist there. And you had the CEOs, you know, Suge Knight and Puffy, trading blows at each other at public events and stuff. And then you had the two artists, Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac, who were once friends but became bitter enemies. But with the benefit of hindsight and doing a bit of research, you come to realize that that whole thing was manufactured.
Right.
The whole thing was a construct. The whole thing was a psyop. It was an engineered beef.
And they were in on it. Yeah.
And it resulted in the murders of Tupac and Notorious B.I.G.
Do you think that they were really killed?
Well, I was going to say, I know there are people who will say that none of these artists really die. You know, these supposed deaths are hoaxes. Right. And I can't rule that out.
Right.
But I tend to think, and I've looked into this a lot, I tend to think you have to address each case on an individual basis. Yeah. And I think there are artists who are able to fake their deaths. Yeah. I think Elvis certainly did.
Really?
I think Jim Morrison did.
Oh, wow.
I think David Bowie may have done.
He seems to have. That one was like the guy who showed up on the news the next day or whatever.
Jack Stephen,
that looked exactly like him. Like,
well, it did. Weird. I've established that guy, Jack Stephen, is a very real person with a history in the record industry. Oh. I've spoken to people that know him personally.
Okay.
So he does have a track record, but they've commented on how strange it was that when he cropped up on that news bulletin the morning after Bowie's supposed death, he looked just like Bowie. And they've said he never used to look that way. Weird. He'd undergone an appearance transformation. So that's weird in itself.
That's bizarre.
But where I was going with this was just to say that I do think some artists are genuinely taken out, are genuinely murdered. And I tend to lean towards that when it comes to Tupac and Biggie.
Okay.
And I think that whole East Coast, West Coast beef was just a way of sowing confusion and dissent and conflict in the hip-hop community. And turning people against each other, just creating turmoil and chaos for what was known to be coming. Because all of this was 95, 96. It was a few years before 9/11. And when it comes to hip-hop albums and artwork and promotional stuff, there is so much foreknowledge of the events of 9/11. There's so much indication that at a corporate level, those that ran the hip-hop industry knew that 9/11 was coming, that you can barely deny it, particularly in the albums of Busta Rhymes. So Busta Rhymes put out a bunch of albums in the 90s, and they all hinted at some apocalyptic, disastrous, calamitous event that was coming. He had one album called When Disaster Strikes. Another one was called Extinction Level Event. And on one of them, you've got the scene of a city going up in smoke and flames in exactly the same way as New York did on 9/11. You've also got an album by J. Rue the Damager called The Sun Rises in the East. And J. Rue the Damager was a very conscious artist putting out great message music. But it seems that, well, I mean, it takes some explaining away as to why on the cover of his album that came out in 1994, he's got a depiction of the World Trade Center towers in New York going up in flames and smoke in exactly the way they did on September 11th, 2001. So I think there was a knowledge at the upper corporate levels of the hip-hop industry that 9/11 was coming. And it was known back in the 90s where they were going to take this whole genre and the way they were going to degrade it and debase it and bastardize it and just make it into this satanic filth that it is now. Totally. Like I say, you can pinpoint that time after 95, 96, that's when the degradation started, straight after the murders of Tupac and Biggie. They were almost symbolic that the art form itself was being murdered.
Yeah.
And things were never the same from that point.
It's almost partially, you know, some people feel like they have to sort of almost get our like agreement or approval or something for these things to sort of happen, and it's almost like that was their approval, that people were okay with it becoming this like very violent and degraded thing.
And what about the predictive programming concerning Tupac and Biggie's deaths that appeared to be foreshadowed in record sleeves? So Tupac put out the album The Don Columinati under the artist name Machiavelli in 1996. And the album included a track called To Live and Die in LA, even though he died in Las Vegas. But on the cover of this album, he's depicted being crucified. And then you got, in 1997, released just a few days before his murder, Notorious B.I.G.'s album, Life After Death. And on the front of the album, he's in a funeral suit next to a hearse. And there's so much on the album that's concerned with death and murder. Wow. And then we get the news that, you know, Biggie's been gunned down in LA a few days later. So again, there seems to have been foreknowledge there of what was going to happen with those two artists, and the world was being subliminally prepared for it. That's how predictive programming works. Right.
Do you think that there's anything that could be possible in the idea that maybe some of this was not necessarily intentionally placed by a specific person to foreshadow this, but that some of it might be almost like a psychic imprint of what's to come? Or do you think it's all, you know, placed there intentionally and with full understanding?
Well, I think that does happen, that phenomenon right there, where energy attracts like energy. Where attention goes, energy flows. This idea that if you focus your will and your intent on something, then you can actually manifest it. And that can happen on a conscious level, where you desire a certain result and you're able to bring it about if you know what you're doing and how to make that process work for you. But it can also happen without your conscious knowledge, where if you're thinking enough about something and applying your energy in that direction, but without specifically focusing on a particular outcome, you can still get that outcome. So if you're talking all the time about death and murder and destruction and surrounding yourself with those kinds of icons and motifs and symbology, then it's not too surprising when that kind of situation arises. But when it comes to the Biggie album, Life After Death, I did carry a story in my first book, Musical Truth 1, about an art director that was used on the photo shoot for that album. And he said that Puffy was in charge of the project, and he had this art director running around all over New York with Biggie, and they were taking photographs in various locations, parks and, you know, certain buildings and certain parts of the city. And he said towards the end of the photo shoot, they ended up in this cemetery, and Puffy had the idea of putting Biggie in this top hat and this black funeral suit, and he got the photographer to take some pictures of him there. And then they were in the studio looking over all the photos and working out which one to use. And this art director says Puffy insisted on using the one where he's in the graveyard. And he says, oh, that's the one. That's the imagery we want. That's going to really sum up the whole album. And he said Puffy was very insistent that that was the one to be used. I quote him in the book. He gave an interview about all this. Wow. So that's pretty strange, isn't it?
Yeah. So he definitely had an idea in mind of what he wanted to carry out.
And Puffy wasn't traveling in the same car as Biggie. Puffy was traveling in a separate car to the one that Biggie got gunned down in. So
how convenient.
Oh, that's lucky, isn't it?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it definitely seems like that is all planned out and intentional. I wonder what you think, to go back to oh, we already addressed that. I'm sorry. Oh, but I was wondering what you meant about the KRS-One and the Africa Bombasta. I don't even know anything about that.
Okay, well, Africa Bambaataa has been consistently held up as one of the founding fathers of hip-hop culture. Okay. So when you get ensconced within that whole scene, you're entrained to think of these three characters as like demigods of the whole genre. One would be Kool Herc, who was like the original hip-hop DJ. So he came out of a reggae sound system culture. He moved over from Jamaica to New York. And in the 1970s, he started throwing block parties in the Bronx, where he would bring turntables and a whole sound system out into the parks. Cool. And they would hook it up to the lampposts in the community and use that to power the sound systems. And that's how the idea of the hip hop block party got started, where everyone from the community would come along and take part in the dancing and the celebration and listening to all this great music. And Kool Herc is universally credited as the guy that started that whole thing off. Then you got Grandmaster Flash, who was also a very prolific DJ, and he's credited with pretty much pioneering the art of turntablism, scratching and cutting and manipulating records, and going to the breaks of certain old soul and funk records, which the break dancers would pick up on, and they would dance to these extended rhythm sections that Flash would create on the decks. Then the third founding father of hip-hop culture is Afrika Bambaataa. So for many years, his real name was given on Wikipedia as Kevin Donovan, but in recent times, his name has changed to Lance Taylor. And this appears to have been done in the wake of a documentary, which is due out sometime this year, I believe, from a lady called Layla Wills, who's a journalist based in Chicago. And she's been following this case of Afrika Bambaataa very closely, and has this film due to come out called Trapped in a Culture. And she uncovered during her research, from speaking to people in the Bronx that knew Bambaataa back in the day, that his real name appears to have been Lance Taylor. And that's now changed on Wikipedia. So there's no longer the claim that he's Kevin Donovan. So there's lots of unanswered questions about this guy. He grew up out of the gang culture in the Bronx in New York in the 1970s. So he was part of the affiliated to a street gang called the Black Spades. And they kind of morphed into the Bronx River Organization, later known as the Organization. And out of that, Bambaataa established a kind of spin-off group known as the Universal Zulu Nation. And the initial story about this was that it was a collective that kind of brought together people that were into hip-hop culture, and it was doing positive things for the community. It was taking kids off the street, keeping them away from crime, and getting them involved in something creative and something beneficial to the community. But in recent years, with the benefit of being able to do this kind of research, it's started to look more and more as if the Universal Zulu Nation has been run along the lines of a kind of cult, a mind-controlled cult, because it bears all the hallmarks of what we know about cults, where people are brought into the fraternity and they're encouraged only to associate with other people in the group and not to have contact with people outside. You have different family members brought into the group, and then you have allegations of sexual misconduct going on, which is a common trait of cults. And this is where the allegations about Bambaataa come in. So in 2016, there were two men who claimed that when they were minors back in the late 70s, early 80s, they were sexually abused on an ongoing basis by Bambaataa. And this opened up a whole can of worms, because there were other people that had been involved with the Universal Zulu Nation who came forward to say it had been kind of a best kept secret. Everyone sort of knew that Bambaataa was into young boys, but it was never spoken about. It's a bit like the Jimmy Savile thing when that story broke over in the UK. Yeah. And loads of people that had worked in the BBC said, oh yeah, everyone kind of knew Jimmy Savile was into kids, but you didn't talk about it. You just knew to keep your mouth shut. Yeah. So similar things in the Universal Zulu Nation. So for some reason, Bambaataa was protected from scrutiny and was untouchable for a very long time. But these two guys came forward with their allegations in 2016, and it cast a whole different light on who this guy was, what the Universal Zulu Nation really was, how it was that he came to gain so much power, both in the street gangs and also at the helm of the Universal Zulu Nation, and why it is that he's held up as one of these legendary demigod figures in hip-hop culture. And in the wake of this, KRS-One, who's had a very long and profitable career, it would seem, out of hip-hop culture, he established the Temple of Hip-Hop, and he really propagated the idea that hip-hop is a religious movement, as we were talking about earlier, that it's a spiritual thing. It's a way of life and a culture. It's so much more than just the music. And he's delivered lectures on this, and he's published books on this, and that's been his career. But he came out in the wake of the Bambaataa allegations to basically defend him, and he made comments along the lines of, I don't give a fuck what he did. It doesn't take anything away from his heritage. It doesn't take anything away from his status. And he was just making light of these allegations and saying he didn't care one way or the other. So he came under fire for that, and people were saying that he was insensitive and this wasn't the responsible statement to make. And right about the same time, there was a Q&A session with him on YouTube where he's taking questions from this audience in this community center or something. And somebody asks him if he's a Freemason. And he answers by saying, I'm not a Freemason, but I know a lot of Freemasons and they trust me with their secrets.
Wow.
So the way I understand it, having never been a Mason myself, is you either are or you aren't.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be entrusted with the secrets of the order if you're not a fully signed up member of it and you've not taken these oaths of allegiance. So he's kind of answering the question, but not really answering it. And then when you think back to some of the music he's put out and some of the imagery that he's rocked, it presents the suggestion that there may be a Freemasonic fraternity within hip-hop culture. And maybe this is the key to what Bambaataa and the Zulu Nation has really been all about. And when you think back to the names of some of these original artists, like Grandmaster Flash, Grandmaster Melly Mel, Grand Wizard Theodore, these are all names that come out of Freemasonry and secret society.
I've never thought of that.
Exactly. And I'd never thought about it until this whole Bambaataa thing emerged. So it's really caused me to revisit the whole of hip-hop history and culture and just ask some questions about where it really all came from. Are we looking at a movement that was started by parties other than what we were trained to think of?
Well, and this would be another way that they would infiltrate and destroy as well, right? If this was some place of power that they saw, there's always going to be multiple pronged attacks, and one is this degradation and turning it into this, filthy, horrifying culture, and then the other might be this, let's put some key people in who are powerful to try and sweep things that way.
Well, we can't discount the suggestion that the whole thing was set up at the start with a long-term goal in mind to destroy it.
True.
Because from what we know about the psychopathic nature of the elite ruling class, they do this all the time.
Right.
An example would be the World Trade Center towers, which there's multiple evidence to suggest that those towers were specifically constructed for the purpose of being brought down 33 years into the future. So 1968 they get constructed, 33, go figure, years later, they come down in the events of September 11th, 2001.
It's too perfect.
There are many genres and cultures and movements that have been started, and for many, many years they appear to be organic and well-meaning and positive. And it's only at some very distant point beyond that where their true nature becomes apparent and they get destroyed or they lead people off in a certain direction. And you come to realize that you've been played all along. It's been one big psyop. We see this with celebrities that do about turns and flip-flops after a while. They gain the trust of their fan base. And then when they've got that further down the line, they just do a bait and switch on them.
It's like Miley Cyrus being in the Disney club and being all cute and innocent for all these years, and then all of a sudden, blam, she's just this horrifying sex creature or whatever.
Exactly, and they do that over and over again. They'll give you somebody to gain your trust. Think of somebody like Russell Brand. I mean, I don't know how much people in the States are up on Russell.
I loved Russell Brand because I was like, wow, he's really getting to the heart of all these things, and then now I'm like, oh, he's just kind of a douche. I don't know. And I'm sure anyone who's in this much fame and this much power can't be an accident, And I kind of
he started doing a lot of social engineering stunts a few years ago. He came out on BBC Newsnight and Question Time, and there's a question in itself: who gets to go on these shows? If you're some renegade maverick comedian that's just operating to his own agenda and speaking what's on your mind, do you really get given a platform by the BBC to go and slam all that stuff? Or is it far more likely that you're running an approved narrative and that you're given these platforms in order to propagate that stuff to people? So Russell Brand is put out there as this goofy kind of comedian, and he's a bit crude and he's a bit edgy, and so he gains a fan base in that way, and people come to like him. I don't know why. Apparently people do. I could never bloody stand him. He tended to polarize opinion, but he for whatever reason he got a fan base. And then a few years ago, he started coming out talking about redistribution of wealth in society and the unjust nature of the class system and all this, and then encouraging people to vote, and just running all these different agendas, basically, which benefit the control system one way or the other. So it becomes clear that that's what he's all about. That's why he was given to us. That's why he became popular. Because if he was just some nobody coming up on TV, nobody would pay any attention to him.
Right.
You've got to get people to like him first. I mean, another great example of all this would be the Beatles, which I've spoken about endlessly. Amazing group, you know, the most successful and influential pop music group in history. And when they first came out, they were a very different group to how they ended up at the end of their career.
They're like clean cut.
Yeah. They burst on the scene in 1962 in the UK. 1964, they go over to the States and they do the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 64, and they endear themselves to American audiences in a very big way. And in those early days, they were all about love songs. They were basically a boy band. They were the boy band of their time in the 60s. And they were doing these innocent, you know, pleasant, sing-along, catchy songs that were all about love and boy meets girl and all this. And they were cheeky and they were likable, and your gran liked them and your auntie liked them. But then you get to 1967, by the time they put out Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it's got tracks like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds on it, and then they do Magical Mystery Tour with I Am the Walrus and all this weird, strange music, which is trippy and it's LSD drenched. They're a very different group to how they started out. And if you're paying attention, and if you know how these agendas work, you realize that it was the plan all along to have them a part of this counterculture that was known to be coming in the second half of the 1960s. They knew LSD was going to come in. They knew they were going to change attitudes in society towards sex and drugs and rock and roll. They wanted to change the whole fabric of society and culture, and they needed their public heroes to be able to achieve that. So people already loved the Beatles. They already trusted them. They already went out and bought all their albums. So by the time they do that switch on them and become a completely different group, nobody really thinks to question them. They just go wherever they're taken. They're like Pied Pipers leading them off up the garden path. You know, they've been doing this forever. That was the 1960s. You could look at endless examples from that day to this. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's worked very well for them all along, these plans.
It's disgusting. It's like when I think about it now, I get this like visceral just disgust with the people who can consciously go along with that and feel totally fine about it, apparently. And it's really sad, but it's interesting to me that there's always like an underground, and it's hard to maybe access or find a lot of times, but you can always find this music from real people who are writing, you know, still this real stuff. There's always going to be some that's just mimicking whatever's popular, but there's always these people who are creating truly, you know, heartful and soulful music that, you know, is sometimes dark and is sometimes light, but it's like the real human experience. And but it's just never going to be like on the radio or sold in stores or, you know, at big concerts or whatever. You have to kind of dig for it to find it.
That's right. I think the gauge of a great band, a great musician, a great song is whether it's on the radio or not. If it's not on the radio, hey, it might be worth listening to. If nothing on the radio is. So the bands that get sidelined and marginalized by the mainstream and that you never stand a chance of seeing on radio or TV, and they're never going to become household names, they're the ones you should pay attention to, because they might just have something meaningful to say.
Yes, and it's again, it's hard to find. It's easier maybe now in the kind of age of like SoundCloud and whatever. There's but again, you have to like dig for it and find it and be really conscious.
You've got to know where to look. And most people are just kept so busy on the hamster wheel of life that they don't have the time to look into this stuff. They don't have the time to go digging and delving the way you have to. They just listen to what's on the radio because it's easier that way, and that's the way the mind control gets done.
Yes. This is why I always liked, there was always like a college radio station wherever I was at. And especially if you listen at like the off hours, sort of, there's these people who are digging because you have more time sometimes when you're in college, and, you know, finding all this great stuff to play that's like you're never going to hear anywhere else. And you can actually find some good stuff that way, but, you know, it's rare.
Well, I do a podcast series called The Sound of Freedom, which consists of music of just that nature, music that you don't get to hear on the radio. Cool. I do play some old tunes. I've got this sequence in it called The Truth Trip, And that's where I go back to previous decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and I select 3 records that they may have been hits, they may be from bands that you've heard of, but they are songs with a message that say something to you, that resonate in some way. But the rest of the show is artists that most people are unlikely to have heard of, but they're making incredible, impactful music that really speaks to you in a major way, in a very profound way. So I've done a showcase of 95 shows so far.
Wow.
To download for free. It's called The Sound of Freedom.
Sound of Freedom.
So it's on Mixcloud and Spreaker, The Sound of Freedom podcast.
Cool.
And as I say, there's 95 shows on there. Most of it is conscious hip hop, but there's a lot of reggae in there. There's a lot of soulful music. There's some dance music. There's some different styles on there. And as far as I can make out, nobody else is doing this, which is incredible to me.
Yeah.
I don't know of any other show of this nature. If there is one out there, I've not come across it. I seem to be the only one that's bringing all this stuff together. And that is astounding to me, because I thought there would be thousands of shows of this nature by now. There should be.
I'm going to send you some music after the show of my boyfriend. I'm going to shamelessly promote him because he won't release his music for some reason, but he makes incredibly conscious, lyrical, amazingly gifted hip-hop. And you can hear it before and after the show if you're ever listening to it. But there's a lot more than that he has too. And he's always said, the reason that he's not famous is because he didn't sacrifice a baby or whatever, which I'm like, probably.
Which is probably true.
Right. So at some level you have to be kind of grateful if you never get famous, because it means that you're kind of still true and pure, probably.
I often say this. I often say not making it big with one of the record companies, not becoming a household name, is the best thing that will ever happen to you.
Right.
It doesn't feel like it at the time. And I know, because I used to want to be on prominent radio stations. I used to want to be on BBC Radio 1 and 1 Extra and all this. And I used to get so frustrated and twisted and bent out of shape when I kept getting knocked back. And they said, no, don't want you, go away. And I used to think, why am I not getting put on here? But now, looking back with the benefit of hindsight and maturity and having done the research, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. It's a lucky escape. And I'm so grateful that I never made it big. Definitely. Because I have my integrity, I have my soul, I have my life force, I have my freedom.
Yes.
And you have none of those things when you sign on that dotted line and you become an owned asset of these corporations. And they're telling you what to do for the rest of your days.
Yes.
So your boyfriend had a lucky escape. Yes. I had a lucky escape, and praise creation for it.
Yes. Yes, I'm absolutely with you. I even wonder sometimes, because I had this, when I first learned who Kesha was, I was like, what an awful piece of trash, as usual, like all of this is crap. And this especially so, especially with that, We're Gonna Die Young, which was hitting like right as, the Sandy Hook event took place, and so it seemed especially ill-timed. But I also had this thought, like, God, I mean, I'm sure like everyone, she just got sucked into it, and she's this pawn, and maybe she didn't even mean to, because I think there are people who don't necessarily understand what they're playing into, right? And so maybe she's that. And then she seemed to have this almost redemption where she came out not that long ago and said that her producer, handler, or whatever was, abusing
Dr.
her.
Luke.
Yes, and she seemed to sort of have a change of heart and even change her music. And so I wonder if it could be that she actually did accidentally get sort of swept up and is actually getting out of it all, or if even that could be part of the agenda, I
don't think they can get out of it all once they reach a certain level. There was a story a few years ago about Lady Gaga. She was doing interviews saying she was fed up with being told what to do. She was fed up with being a puppet. And from now on, she was going to call the shot. She was going to be in charge of her output and her creativity. And the next thing you know, she's cropping up at these award shows, whether it's the Grammys or the US Super Bowl. I forget which one. But she's got all this bloody Illuminati symbolism and all this Masonic garb everywhere, and all the signs and symbols, the eyes and the 666 signs and the black and white checkerboard flooring, and you realize that that breaking free of the industry didn't really go too well, did it? Because it's not an option for you once you reach that level. And I've actually come to have a great deal of sympathy for people like Kesha.
Yeah,
it's very easy to hate on them. That's your primary instinct. And people like Nicki Minaj, and you look at what they're propagating to young girls, particularly when you have daughters yourself, as I do, who are in the target age group of all this trash, and it's very easy to look at these artists and just feel hateful scorn towards them for what they're putting out there. that you come to realize that they have no choice in the matter. In many cases, they're mind controlled themselves. They've undergone satanic ritual abuse. They've undergone trauma-based mind control from the youngest of ages. Right. In many cases, they're born into it. It's just by virtue of the family that they come from. There's certain, family bloodlines where new generations that are born into that family just get pushed into these chosen career paths. They might get put into Hollywood movies. They might get put into politics. They might get put into television. They might get put into music. These roles are decided for them. Yeah. And from a very young age, they start becoming these performing, monkeys, clowns, whatever. I mean, look at Michael Jackson, started at God knows what young kind of an age, and Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake, they were child stars. Miley Cyrus was a child star. Justin Bieber was a child star. We find this time and time again. They're just pushed into it. By the time they reach adulthood, it's all they've known, being a part of this sick, demonic industry machine. And they are largely just going through the motions and doing what their handlers tell them to do. And we should reserve some sympathy for them, because that's not any kind of an existence to have. Yeah. And we see it going all the way into adulthood. Look at Madonna. Madonna is 61 years of age now. Jeez. And she cuts a very tragic character, because she's still up there gyrating around in bloody leotards at the age of 61. Nobody wants to see 61-year-old women in leotards. No. They just don't.
There's something about it that's just like innately like degradatory. I don't know, like you should be a grandmother now.
Exactly. You should be settling down and just enjoying your life with some dignity.
Yes, and having some respect for your body.
That fits your age. But she's up there on stage and she's still got all the Illuminati symbolism, and she's pushing all the same old sigils and signs and icons and motifs that the 20-year-olds are doing. Yeah. And she's doing it at 60 years of age. Somebody sent me a video earlier to Bucks Fizz. I don't know if you remember that group from the 80s, from the early 80s. They won the Eurovision Song Contest in 1981. It's a group out of the UK. And they had a lot of hits in the 80s. And back then they were young, and a couple of blonde women, very good to look at, a couple of blonde guys for the ladies. And, they're a very attractive group. And they had lots of catchy pop songs. But somebody sent me a video of them that is brand new now. And now they're all in their 60s. And they're all wrinkled and haggard. And they look like they should just be taking it easy in some rest home somewhere. But they're still up there on stage, and they're pushing the same old signs and symbols. God. They've got black and white checkerboard flooring. They've got all the mind control symbolism, all the SRA symbolism. And you think, wow, here they are in their 60s, and they're still not free of it. Yeah. They still can't break away from all this, because I don't think they're doing all this because they really, really want to be doing it. No. They're doing it because they have no choice, because they still have handlers, and they're still owned, and they're still being controlled and directed in everything that they do. So it's a little reminder that once you're in for life, and you ain't getting out.
Yeah. And some of the most tragic examples of that are when some people seem to break through a tiny bit, sometimes on stage, on camera, and they're like screaming for help. Like Katy Perry was at some point just like yelling and like, help me. And then she like kind of snapped out of it again. And you're like, it's like her trapped inner self finally got through, and then it's like even more tragic, because you're like, well, then that means she's in there somewhere, like observing all of this and unable to stop it. And that is a truly terrifying concept.
It's the world of mind control alters.
Yeah.
Alternate personalities. And I don't know how you get this stuff through to kids, because one of the most depressing things I ever see is when an artist comes out with a new video and it's pushing the same old agendas as all the others. And you look at the video on YouTube and you go to the comments section, and there's people saying, wow, this is awesome. This is great. I love this. It's so cool. They're so in control. He so knows what he's doing, or she's so fashionable, she's so creative. And you think, no, we've seen this 1,000 times before.
It's literally not creative.
This creativity is coming from the handlers and the managers. You really think the artists choose their own costumes, choose what to have in their videos? They're just doing what they're told, and people can't see it. Yeah. But I think that the biggest hope we have is, rightly or wrongly, when it comes to young people, I think we need to make conspiracy culture cool and give it this cachet of like, if you're someone that's in the know and you understand how the industry is really run, you're a little bit smarter than your friends, because you know that these are just puppets that are being put up there to parade and perform. If we could get young people to lock onto the idea that they're clued up and they know what's going on. I know there's this word woke that is going around among young people that say, oh, I'm woke, as if, you know, they figured it all out. They know the way the world is run now. That's a completely bogus bullshit kind of thing. But
right.
I'm just thinking about how you get young people to understand how they're being manipulated and mind controlled. And if you can get them to look at sites like Vigilant Citizen, which break down the symbolism in videos and tell you exactly what's going on, that's the greatest hope we have, I think, just to make it cool to be clued up on ulterior motives and alternative agendas.
Yes.
I think we need to do, because this is always the big concern. I do a lot of conferences, I do a lot of presentations at meetup groups and stuff like this. And I look out into the audience, and for the most part, I see people who are 40 plus.
Yeah.
You know, there's some events where the average age is probably 48. And you think, well, like I said earlier, by the time you reach 48, you have kind of figured a few things out. But how do you get through to the 18-year-olds? Because you never see 18-year-olds at these conferences, and they're the ones that you really need to reach. So we really need to be thinking about ways to get through to the ones that are directly the targets of these agendas.
Yeah.
And, you know, any way that we can do that has to have value to it.
Yeah, it is really, really hard, because they've also kind of, I think, got that market cornered too, where they, like, you know, you saw a few years ago that, like, the Illuminati started becoming like this popular buzzword, and it was like you know, it was like in Taco Bell and shit. Like, it was kind of being like, oh, isn't this cool to be like so ulterior and like behind the scenes?
I know all
like,
about the Illuminati. I'm down, man.
Right. And then like that urge, because I think kids do have this natural urge to sort of get to like, what are the secrets and mysteries in the world, and like, how can we figure this all out? And that gets sort of like tunneled off to that, you know, this other direction, or this like false wokeness or whatever, you know. And so I think they've kind of got that down, and it sucks, because I think like you were saying, the sort of age group you are usually, when you get to these sort of truths, like, you're no longer cool to the kids or whatever. And so it is harder to send that message. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I was a teacher, it was easier for me because I had access to kids all day, every day. And so every once in a while I'd be able to kind of like have a nicely placed question that would make them be like, why are these artists like constantly obsessed with death? And, you know, or things like that. But other than that, I do not know how you would ever do this.
Yeah. And it's ingenious the way they serve up these genres and they serve up these public heroes to young people, so that they feel this is something that is for them and which defines their generation. Yes. It was that way for me. You know, the music I grew up with and the movies I watched and the fashions that were around, that was my generation. Yeah. That was us. That was,
and no one else understands.
And my parents didn't understand, the older generation. And back then I was thinking of people of the age that I am now. And I was thinking of them as old and dumb and boring. They don't know what's what. They're not hip, man. They're not cool. And this is the way they do it. They give young people something that they latch onto, and they feel this defines them.
Yes.
And what they're going through and their generation and their people. And so when somebody comes in to try and criticize it, somebody like me, and I try and point out what's really going on with this, a lot of young people will just not listen. They'll just block it out, because it's like you're trying to diss their culture.
Yes.
And what do you know about it, granddad? You know. So that's a difficult one to overcome. But I think any smart kids that have any scintilla of critical thinking ability about them must be able to see that the same old agendas are being pushed and pushed and pushed. All these videos, how many bloody videos do you have to see with black and white checkerboard flooring to realize that there's a reason why it's there?
Right.
How many all-seeing eyes of Horus, or, you know, pyramids with the eye of Providence in it, do you have to see?
Yes.
To realize that something is trying to be communicated here.
In like a subliminal, a subliminal symbolic way. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, surely anyone with an ounce of intelligence about them has got to be able to spot that there's something going on here. I don't think it was as blatant when I was growing up.
I don't
either. Really don't. I mean, I've gone back and examined 1980s pop videos, and I've discovered some stuff in there.
Yeah.
There are signs and symbols that you get now that were there in the 80s, but it wasn't every video.
Yeah.
And the music didn't all sound the same. it wasn't all using the same blueprints and templates, which it demonstrably is now.
Yeah.
I did a podcast with Jason Lindgren a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he's a professional musician and studio producer.
Right.
And we were breaking down some contemporary pop songs. And I was saying, give me your professional opinion and your engineer's ear of what's going into these productions. And he was talking about, you know, the way they're being constructed and the electronics that are being used, the algorithms. And this is the way music is being produced now.
Yeah.
It's like being rolled off a production line, like cans of beans.
It's just like a formula, and they just plug all the little pieces in and then just push it out.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter if it's Kesha singing it, or Miley Cyrus, or Taylor Swift, or Britney Spears, or Katy Perry, because it all sounds the goddamn same anyway.
Yes.
The singer is irrelevant.
Well, and they've proven that, you know, that one of the things that determines if somebody is going to like a song or not is the number of times they've heard it. So like just repetition is enough for you to be like, oh, I like this song, you know, which is more like your way of saying this is a familiar thing, instead of actually like a feeling of like, or like an emotional response, or, you know, a truly like in tune sort of understanding of what's going on, which is interesting because when I think back to when I used to listen to the radio, it was like the same 10 songs over and over and over again.
Exactly.
And, you know,
Exactly.
they know
That's
this.
why they do it.
Right.
Yep. And it's the same songs on every station as well.
Yes, yes.
They don't even differ from station to station.
And it's kind of interesting. We're talking about waking, you know, the kids up if we can, which is the ideal, because that's why they're targeting them, is they have the best chance of being completely controlled and derailed. And so if you can stop that, you've created this like very powerful force in the world. But how do you wake up even an adult, you know, because you can point to like, look at every single major production that's been staged in the past 10 years and they all have exactly these same elements. Why? And still people will be like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's cool. Like, I don't know, but I mean, it's like you said, like people are too busy and we are on this hamster wheel, but
well, the mind control works with older people as well.
Yeah.
You know, you have older people, they might be in their 60s or 70s, and they grew up on the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Doors, the Grateful Dead, Queen, David Bowie, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin. You try telling them anything about those groups and how they may have been controlled and they may have been pushing agendas, and they're not trying to hear it.
No.
I mean, I've had this with Beatles fans, trust me. I've had this conversation many times. People have said, you don't know what you're talking about. You weren't around then. What do you think you know? The Beatles were the greatest thing. And of course they were organic. Of course they were natural. Of course they were just 4 working class lads from Liverpool that wrote a few catchy songs and just got lucky. How dare you suggest any different? And people have a very strong attachment to these groups. And it's the same thing as I mentioned earlier. The way kids these days are going to love Justin Bieber and Cardi B or whoever else is around at the moment. Back in the 60s and 70s, you know, these guys that are in their 70s now were young then.
Yeah.
And they were latching on to the Who and the Rolling Stones and all these, and they still have that nostalgia attached to those groups, and they don't want to have to acknowledge that these golden memories that they have of greater times in their lives could have been founded on lies, and there could have been ulterior motives there. So if they acknowledge that now in their 60s and 70s, they have to come to the very painful acknowledgement that they've lived the last 40 or 50 years under mind control. And they've been mugged off and made fools of. And the human ego is a very powerful thing, and people do not want to admit to themselves that they've been mugged off. I've had to do it, and it's been a very painful process. There's people I looked up to. I used to think certain scenes were the bee's knees, the dog's bollocks, as we say in England, and you come to realize that they were anything but. It's a very painful thing, and it's understandable why people don't want to go through that process. But at the end of the day, as I say so often, you're someone who either wants truth or you don't. It's one thing or the other.
That's absolutely true. And it is that emotional attachment that is often a barrier, and that builds up that ego and keeps you from kind of going there, because it is very humbling to realize how you've been played. And I think all of us, anybody who's been through this process would resonate with that you know, that's a hard thing to go through. And I know we're winding down, but you had said, you know, in 2010 or so was when you kind of became sort of like hip to all of this. So what was it that kind of got you looking this direction?
Well, there wasn't a singular event. There wasn't this wild moment of epiphany where I suddenly got everything. It was a process that I was going through. Part of it was just observing how the music had changed, because I was a working DJ. It was still my main source of income and my livelihood all the way up until, well, about 2014 is when I completely wound down. So for the first 10 years of this millennium, I was still out there working as a radio and club DJ. And that was just the way I defined myself. But I'd noticed that the music had degraded big time, particularly from 2000 onwards. By the time you got to 2010, so-called hip-hop was all full of bloody auto-tune. Yeah. And it just sounded electronic, and everything was just grating, and it just sounded disgusting, and it was overproduced and over-compressed. And I just thought, what is going on with this? How has this music got so bad? And I started to question, how can it have been allowed to regress this far if it's not part of some plan or other?
Is there not something better out there?
Yeah. At the same time, I was coming to some very slow realizations that the world is not the way we thought it was. And when you have all these wars going on, and you have all this apparent injustice, and you have poverty, and you have famine, and you have suffering and hardship, I just started to question, what kind of world is this where all that can go on and just be allowed to happen, unless it's meant to happen? And round about that time, I got turned on to the books of David Icke, largely by my dad. So my dad was always an alternative thinking kind of guy. Okay. And he read all sorts of books. He would always have a big pile of books by his armchair, and they'd be on everything from UFOs to bloody life after death to all kinds of stuff. And he put me on to David Icke. And at the time, I had the same view of David Icke as most other people in the UK did up until a few years ago, which was that he was a nutter. Yeah. he was a guy that, was once a BBC television presenter, and something happened to him and he lost his mind, poor man. But I decided I'd give it a go. And, my dad said, just read them and see what you think. And so I started reading the books, and they made a hell of a lot of sense. And I found that they answered so many of the questions that I had. And I came to understand why there's always war, why nothing ever seems to change in the political system, because it's not meant to, because politicians aren't there to help us. They're not there to make our lives better. The CIA, MI6 aren't there to protect us from harm. In most cases, they cause the harm. Yes. So I came to understand all of this, how everything is backward. Yes. And there's this rich-poor divide because it's meant to be there. And there's a system in place to keep the vast bulk of humanity in poverty, or just below below the bread line. Yeah. And all this started to make sense. So it was a process, and by the time I got to 2010, it just felt like I'd got all the pieces to a jigsaw puzzle together, and I put the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle. I could see the picture, and I thought, my god, so that's what the world is. Yeah. And here we are, 10 years, getting on for 10 years later, and nothing's ever been the same. Yeah.
Oh, what a beautiful process. I know that a lot of people like to look down at David Icke or like Alex Jones, not that they're that similar, but the different kind of icons in the truth community, whether they're like shills or not. But I always like to remember that they play like a role for a lot of people waking up, no matter if they're kind of co-opted or not, or if there's elements of their ideas that are like maybe not truthful or not. It really doesn't matter, because in the end, they're still waking up a lot of people. And as long as you have that...
I would not be here on this interview with you now if it wasn't for having read the books of David Icke. So people can say whatever they want about he's a shill, he's a gatekeeper, everyone's got an opinion. Yes. Whatever he is, he got me here. Yeah. And I took the inspiration that I got from him, from reading the words of his books, and I attended his lectures and listened to his radio shows and stuff. And I decided that I wanted to get on that same path of communicating truthful information to others. Yes. And so here we are 10 years later, and I'm now doing my lectures, and I've got my books, and I do my podcasts. And people often write to me very kindly and say, thank you for the information you put out. You've changed my entire outlook on life, and you've made me think about things in a completely different way. And I always say to them, all I'm doing is paying it forward. Yeah. Because other people did that for me. I moved on from David Icke and started looking at other researchers, and there have been others that have inspired me greatly. Yes. And I'm now taking that process and that influence that they had on me and communicating that to others, and I'm paying it forward. Now, if everyone that I affect in a positive way pays it forward themselves, each one teach one, then imagine the exponential snowball effect of truthful, empowering information getting out there.
What a beautiful thing. Yes. And that's a great message to send to anybody listening. And I know there's a lot of people who sort of sit on that idea of like, you know, oh, I might, or I don't know if I'm like good enough or smart enough or whatever. And it's like, it really doesn't matter. Wherever you're starting, whatever you communicate, as long as it's with truth and with that intention, like you're going to have that exact same effect. And even if you only affect one person, you know, you're changing the world, but you're going to affect way more than that the longer you keep doing it. So I think that's a great message to send.
And people have different skills and different things to offer. So
absolutely,
I find it very easy to put radio shows together. I find it quite easy to write books. I can do that. I realize not everyone can. There's a whole load of things I can't do.
True.
I can't edit video. I've got no idea.
I suck at that.
But there are other people that are an absolute techno wizard when it comes to putting videos together. So maybe that's something you could be doing. You could be helping other researchers in putting out great videos. Maybe you're someone that is really good getting up on a microphone and addressing large groups of people. Maybe you're good at organizing events. Maybe you're good at organizing campaigns. Everyone has different skills. Maybe you're great with artwork.
Yes.
And you can communicate through, you know, images and graphics. Everyone's got something to offer. And you know, each person will know what that skill is in themselves.
Absolutely. I love it. So where, I know it's pretty obvious maybe, but where can people find you if they want to find more of Mark Devlin?
Okay, well, my main website is markdevlin.co.uk. So there's links through to all my other stuff from there. My YouTube channel is Mark Devlin TV. So it's youtube.com/Mark Devlin TV. Got a whole bunch of my lectures up on there. I've got a whole bunch of my radio shows in video form up on there. There's some Q&A sessions. There's all sorts of stuff up on there. Then the books that I've got out, Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2. In those books, I brought together everything that I'd come to understand about the true nature of the corporate music industry, much of what we've spoken about today, but a whole load more. So Volume 1 came out in 2016, Volume 2 came out in 2018. They're both available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other places, but if anyone wants to get one from me direct, they're welcome to send me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and I can post out signed copies anywhere in the world. Awesome. And I've just put out a novel. I've put out my first work of allegorical fiction. It's called The Cause and the Cure, and I really enjoyed the process of writing that. It's coded and layered. So on the surface of it, it appears to be a crime thriller, like a murder mystery type thing. It's set in Oxford, England, my home city, in 1990, 30 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And it's full of period detail from those times. So I've tried to really transport people back to what life was like in 1990. And I've focused very heavily on the technological side of things in society, because the technology that people were using in 1990 to what we're using today, you would think you're living in a different universe.
For real.
Because so much has changed in that relatively short period of time. So I've really focused on that. The book has lots of truth bombs encoded into the narrative. It's symbolic and metaphorical in places. There's spiritual teachings, natural law teachings involved. So if people want to really delve into it and gain the full cause and the cure experience, there's many levels that it can be read on. So that one is available from the same sources as well.
I love it. And I'm guessing part of what it lays out there in that symbolic and metaphorical way is the cause of what's wrong and the cure for it.
Yeah, well, this is, the title is sort of an allusion to natural law.
Okay.
And karma and hermetic principles of consequentialism. So through the story, it basically reinforces the truism that what you put out into the world in terms of your thoughts, emotions, and actions determines the experiences that you undergo, and they come back at you in a very direct way. Consequentialism in effect, natural law in effect. And what you see through the story is the characters involved, by the end of it, all get what they deserve based on the free will choices that they've made.
Woo.
In terms of their behaviors.
Sounds awesome.
So yeah, everything comes full circle. And I'm just trying to, when I say it's a teaching tool, that might turn certain people off because they don't want to be preached to.
Right.
But like to think I've made it entertaining. I think it's a gripping, thrilling story. But if you read it in the spirit in which it's intended, you'll come away from it knowing a whole load of stuff. Because although it's fiction, it's really truth fiction.
I love it.
But putting a message out there under the guise of fiction is a great thing to do.
Absolutely.
Because if ever you get attacked for it, and people love to attack you.
Oh, yes, they do.
I don't know if you've noticed, Lindsay, but everyone's got an opinion. Everyone wants to tell you how it should be done. Yeah. Everyone wants to tell you you've got it wrong and you should do it this way. Now, if anyone comes at me and says, you said this in that book and you shouldn't have said that, I can say, chill, man. It's fiction.
Yeah.
Come on. It's just a story.
I love it.
No, fuck off, you know.
But it's also like this incredibly easy way to digest these sort of large, overwhelming truths. And I think, which is part of why they like to use these methods as well. But, you know, part of that ability to transport yourself into the story and identify with the characters and the symbolism and the experiences they have sort of like help you reflect on your own experiences and learn from that. So it is definitely a teaching tool, but it's not like that sort of stodgy, like rote memorization and like, you know, preachy sort of thing. It's this much more personal experience, I guess.
Yeah, I think you get that from great songs as well. Really well crafted songs that might only be 3 or 4 minutes. But a really great song that's been well crafted and well thought through by the songwriter and the musicians can really affect you and really stay with you and communicate knowledge to you. You can hear a song and memorize it 20 years later and you're still thinking of those lyrics, and that's what can be achieved with a song in 3 or 4 minutes. And it's taken me, you know, 350 odd pages and what is it 67,000 words to get that story across, but whatever way it can be done.
Absolutely. And everybody relates to these different like methodologies as well better. You know, some people are mostly readers and some people, I'm really bad at listening to music, honestly. Like I don't know what my problem is, but other people are very musical and that like affects them a lot more. And so I think we need all of these, just like we were kind of just saying, whatever your skill is and whatever your passion is, we need all of these methods to get to everyone and to help everyone along. Yeah. I'm doing an audio version of the book as well. I'm narrating it because a lot of people have said to me that they're so damn busy. Again, like we were saying earlier, life keeps you so frantic and hectic the whole time that they just don't have time to sit down and read a book. And I sympathize. I don't have time to sit down and read books. I have to really, really force myself to make the time. So a lot of people said they find it more convenient to listen to books in audio form as they're going about their day. So I'm catering to that by doing an audio version of it, which I think is a good thing. Perfect. When do you expect that to be ready for people?
Oh, it's taken forever.
Yes, I know.
I recorded some of it today, actually, and it's not the recording of it that takes the time, it's the editing.
Again, yes, it's always the editing. Well, I'm with you. I'm also doing an audiobook version of my books, and I think that you and I might be kind of rare in that we both have written our books and are narrating our own books, because I think most people don't find that they can do both. And I don't think I have like the best voice for these things, but I think that I think it's kind of nice, and you can tell me what you think about this, that you know how you meant each word or each idea, or you know how it, like, I think you're the best narrator of your work, right?
Yeah, you get all the little subtle nuances and all the right tone of voice and all that, because you know what you were trying to convey with that line.
You can put that emotion into it. Like,
the editing is killing me. I mean, I started round about Christmas, so what is that, 6 weeks ago? My book is 39 chapters. I've just got to chapter 21. So it's taken me 6 weeks to do just over half the book.
I relate. I'm really lucky too, in that my boyfriend, again, is a musical artist. And so he has all of the equipment for it, and he has all of the editing know-how, and he's actually editing it for me. So I'm very lucky for that. So.
Very lucky. What takes the time is getting rid of all the little pops and crackles and coughs and splutters and just
but for him, he's like, it's done. I'm like, oh, okay, thanks. So I'm sorry, I'm not trying to rub it in, but well, that's awesome.
It'll be out soon enough. I mean, hopefully it'll be out in the spring sometime.
That's great. Yes, I hope to be around the same timeline as you. So,
What is your book?
Well, I have 3 books actually. I have a memoir that I wrote about teaching on a Native American reservation, and which is very humorous and short and irreverent and easy to read, sort of. And then I have my first novel, Sine Curve of Aeons, which is quite thick, and the writing is quite small. So this is, I don't know, it's like 460 pages or something. So it's a bit much, but it's kind of like what you described, I'm trying to encase all of these sort of ideas of spiritual truth and the path that we travel through life and the forces that are kind of against us in this narrative version. And that's the one I'm working on the audiobook right now. And then I'm actually almost done with the sequel to this, Sine Curve of Aeons, which will be done hopefully, I don't know, well, let's just say within a month. That's the best goal I have. Because we all have other things we're working on, and we can't, if you could be recording and editing all day long, I'm sure you would have finished your audiobook a while ago, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, I just snatch an hour here, 45 minutes there. It's probably the same for you.
Absolutely. So we all working to pay for doing what we love in actuality, I think. But
yeah, pretty much so.
And
I have
a
day job as well.
Family too, so.
I have a family. I have a day job. I have to go out and work, same as anyone else.
Right.
So it's a drag.
But I think that part of that is kind of inspiring for people as well, where they realize that you can, tuck these things in on the side as your passion projects almost. You don't have to make this your whole life. Like, I don't rely on, in fact, I don't really get income from this at all. I've only just started getting like $20 a month here and there, sort of. So like, I'm getting like a tiny bit, and I'm sure maybe that will grow somewhat, but I don't think it's ever going to be my main thing. I think I'm always probably going to work, and that's okay, because this is what I enjoy doing. I don't do it to make money, and I guess I'm lucky in that. If you were forcing yourself through these things, like writing a book or giving presentations, then it wouldn't be that effective anyway,
That's right, yeah. You don't want to be reliant upon it as your main source of income. Otherwise, you're going to be putting out content just for the sake of it.
Yes, and then you're also
you shouldn't be doing that. You put out content when you've got something to say.
Yes, and then you're also more, I think, easily controlled at that point, because they know they've got you. Like, oh, well, now we can kind of threaten this person in this way, and then they have to produce that content, or else their whole livelihood is gone. And I never want.
Well, we probably all know people who have YouTube accounts which they've monetized, and they're doing very well from it.
Yeah.
But you realise that if YouTube ever pulled the plug on them,
yes,
that's going to be a major problem, because their main source of income is now gone. How are they going to pay their rent this month now? It's not a good position to get yourself in. You need many different options.
Yes.
Working for
diversify. And also, I don't have the highest expectations out of what, I don't need like a fancy house or a fancy car or all of these things. So I don't have a lot of need for a lot of money either. And I don't have kids, so that also helps.
Well, it would, yeah.
Yeah. But, well, as we wrap up, I always like to ask people what your kind of final words that you want to leave people with, or what sort of message that you want to have people think about as they're heading away from the show.
Well, that's an interesting one. I don't always think of myself as the best kind of person to give motivational advice to people. I'm certainly not one of these motivational speakers that gets up there and gets the crowd all cheered up and has everyone shouting out slogans and stuff like that. I find myself getting down a lot. Yeah. I find life difficult. Mm-hmm. I find just getting through the day to be a struggle, and I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people will relate to this. I struggle with a lot of things, and I often have to remind myself why I'm doing all this, because it often seems hopeless when you look around you at all the stuff that's being done to us. And the way I keep myself going is by constantly reinforcing the idea in my mind that those of us that have come to a realization of what's going on in this world, how humanity is being enslaved and controlled and kept away from its true path, we take on a personal responsibility to do whatever we can to try and improve that situation. And no matter how hopeless it might seem and how ineffective you might think your efforts are, you still have to do them. You still have to know that you gave it all you could. And when you get to that point, you can have a clear conscience, and you can know that you've done what you came here to do, and you don't have to beat yourself up over not taking on that responsibility. So you just got to keep going and keep doing it and stay on the path and get through those dark days with the knowledge that this is what you're here to do. And I think if you can get through your life with that kind of philosophy, what lies beyond it is going to be in your favor, let's say. It's going to be very beneficial for your soul versus doing bugger all or giving up.
Yes.
Let me leave it at that.
That's a beautiful statement, and I love that candidness of how difficult and hard life seems, and I think that makes it even more relatable, and what a beautiful message to leave people with. So, fellow travelers of the path, it is a beautiful thing. This has been your analog, electric, concentric dose of wisdom, according to Mark Devlin. Mark, it has been a pleasure and honor to have you, and thank you so much for everything today.
Thanks for having me on. It was a great chat. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome, thank you. So the most influential forces on our psyches and our souls are those that are unseen and unexamined. Whatever we place our attention on in calm observation begins to dissolve into simple truth. And when we are in that place of rational view of the truth, our path becomes utterly clear and easily followed. To resist the dark forces that may have dug their way into your subconscious and controlled your thoughts and behaviors for far too long, simply be present in your own mind, in your own body, and while unattached to the outcome, watch where the truth will lead. You can never go to the wrong way when you start from this place. And until your observation is crystal clear, my friends, travel well, aim for balance, and always look inside first.
So do your homework, make your dome hurt. While up on earth, my bones are blessed from holy dirt. Vibes manifested to words that told me search for verbs and adjectives to describe birth. Worth more than one can speak, while the tongue beats a weak, a sour taste in your mouth, bittersweet. Words can also kill you when you sleep, mind condition. Low frequencies while the subconscious mind listens. I can tell a vision filled with lies, disguised as truth, and spread it like the word to the youth. Watch the tube. A place where the God gets food is sorcery. To recreate the God forgery does more than meets the eye. Not too many know. Just hear me flow like the eye of Horus Penio. Yeah, not ready to leave until we believe we're free to go. You hear me go?
Sculpted from the ether, the material will eat ya. Stuck on this plane, lanes use jet fuel to greet ya. The dimensional three ain't meeting me on top of the fourth. Didn't climb Jacob's ladder to squab with a sword. Forged with Yggdrasil, branch down, try quiet your lamps now. Ascension past the matter that they slam out they damn mouths. We ain't on land now, but they over understand. Sacrificing wisdom, hoarding dumber, kosher, wicked hands. Putting faith in worthless worship of the mortals. Artificial portals, mass ingestion of the black goo. Bioengineered morsels, conversing with machine elves. Bypassing maggots, they stuck on Android screens now. I'm scrolling emerald tablets. Moloch living lavish, off the back to the savage. Them clasped hands at the Sabbath. Smack of energy damage, they done twisted the tongues. With nanotech in the lungs, the awakening's begun. All they really can do is fucking run.